is Straight to the Source, your destination for food, views and big ideas. Brought to you by two of the best in the business, Tawnya and Lucy Allen. Join them to discover some of Australia's most dynamic food, hospitality and agribusiness leaders.
Hello and welcome to Food, Views and Big Ideas. I'm Tawnya Barr.
And I'm Lucy Allen, and this is the podcast from us here at Straight to the Source.
In this podcast, we will be introducing you to the people who are driving our food and hospitality industry forward. Whether it be on the land, in the water, in the kitchen, or from the boardroom.
Each of our guests are playing a significant role in the evolution of Australia's food identity and culture, and we want you to know who they are, their views and their big ideas. We're coming to you today from Gadigal land, and we'd like to begin by paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today.
Today's guest is Glenn Dibbin, longtime shellfish farmer responsible for the evolution of the Akoya from pearl cultivation to food.
This is such a fascinating story of innovation in developing the Akoya for culinary consumption. Glenn is part of the team at Leeuwin Coast, which is a Western Australian aquaculture business who have spent the last 6 years researching and trialling sustainable techniques to cultivate and harvest Akoya for food at scale.
For listeners that are hearing about Akoya for the first time, they're a bivalve from the pearl oyster family, traditionally famous for producing saltwater pearls, and they live naturally in the pristine waters around Albany, which, if you don't know where that is, it's in the southernmost town and seaport of Western Australia.
What's really exciting about this is how sustainability is a core pillar of Leeuwin Coast's production and practices, from the way that they're growing the Akoya all the way through to the way that they're sending it to market. In fact, their shellfish have been accredited carbon neutral by Climate Active, which is an Australian government initiative and one of the most rigorous certifications in the world.
For chefs, this is incredibly exciting. It's not often that the world is presented with a new ingredient, one with no culinary reference point. So from a creative perspective, it's a blank canvas. And the internal shell is beautiful.
It's absolutely stunning. And the Akoya is so versatile. We've tasted it cured, raw, cooked. It's complementary to so many different flavors and it's suitable to so many different cuisines. It's really quite a unique product.
Shall we get this conversation started, Lucy?
Let's do it. Glenn, welcome to the Straight to the Source podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very excited to have you in the studio today and to chat to you about the Akoya.
The whole podcast is about, food, views and big ideas. And boy, this is a big idea, isn't it?
Definitely is. And thanks a lot for having us on. It's exciting.
You mentioned when we were chatting recently that, first of all, you haven't done a podcast before, so we're very excited to have you on board today, but also that you've been learning a lot on this journey as well. So we'd love you to maybe take us back to the start and tell us where this Akoya project and journey started for you.
About 15 years ago, we started to see some dramatic changes in the environment. And these were results of different land runoff nutrients, as well as we presume the climate change response along the coastline. So we started to see warmer water, less nutrients in the water, which support those traditional farming things we were doing, which were the mussels and the rock oysters. So we approached the government, the West Australian government, and said, look, if they really want a bivalve industry within the state, they need to underpin it with a multi-species bivalve hatchery, which at that time we couldn't afford to actually set up in our own right, the farmers. So to the credit of West Australian government, they did that, and it allowed us to begin exploring other species of bivalves that we couldn't collect out in the wild, but we could grow. So we started exploring the oceans in a sense, and to some extent what you look at is the oceans are huge amounts of food sources that have been untouched. And the only reason we haven't sort of eaten them, a lot of them yet, is because they were very hard to commercially catch using traditional methods like boats and nets. But it does mean, but once we start going down the farming process, it opens a world of opportunities. And so we explored that. We started seeing the Akoya. There was naturally small settlements at both Albany and Coburn Sound. So we started looking at the Akoya first up for its use for pearl production. So traditionally, when you look at the Akoya, its history dates back to the Persians and the Egyptians, some 4,000 years of recorded history. And it's mainly to do with pearl production, using collecting the wild stocks for pearls as well as for the shells. So they use the shells for things like buttons and for inlays into furniture and other things like combs and whatever, all had pearl shell.
So Glenn, you set up the hatchery and then you were sort of looking to the water for other species that you could grow. Where did you, was the Akoya just growing on the mussel lines, or how did you come across? Yeah.
So there's some small-scale recruitment of the Akoya on the actual line. So basically, they'll be mixed in with the mussel lines also on our floats. The Akoya distribution is all the Indo-Pacific region. So it goes all the way up to Japan on the Pacific side, as well as all the way under the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. So basically, it's got a really long distribution. And it's mostly distributed by its temperature range. And we think it's around between, say, 13 degrees up to about 27 degrees. Wherever that water in that area, this Akoya will survive. And so traditionally it came from the Egyptians, and when wild harvesting that, we used to probably get a pearl in 1 in 500. Every 500 shells don't end up with a pearl. You can obviously see that's not sustainable in the sense that they would have really quickly, especially because they were diving without air to collect these animals, they quickly sort of stripped the near shore areas out. So they kept expanding outwards. His history goes back to around the Sri Lanka as well, in all those shallow depth water. So the Akoya's got a long history. It wasn't until about probably 120 years ago that the Japanese started to do it in large scale in a farming technique. They sort of got the process of pearling, and that's where they actually place the seed within the pearl to then get that seed covered in nacre and start producing farm pearls.
The Japanese were cultivating it for pearls. Do you think they were eating it as eating the byproduct of that production, or just focusing on the pearl production?
We think they'd eat the abductor mussel at the end, similar to when you look at so there's a couple of pearl species. When you look at the Akoya pearl species, there's also the Maxima pearl species, which is a species we get, which is a South Sea off broom, which ends up the size of a dinner plate. And that's what produces the really big pearls out of broom. So that's what they call the South Sea pearl. And the Akoya is just a lot smaller, so it never gets to the size of it. So they would use just the abductor mussel when they went to harvest the oysters at the end, not the whole animal like we're advocating.
But they would use the shell. They would use the shell in ornamental furniture and production and that sort of thing. Okay.
Definitely, yeah. So basically, in the pearl production, when you look at it, it's probably about 2.5 years old when they actually introduce the seed to the pearl, and then it may spend the next, say, 2 years or 18 months producing the nacre and actually covering the pearl. So when we look at in the food production, we're looking at it in the period from probably about 12 to 18 months. We think that's the period. As it gets a lot larger than that, we think the flavour profile changes and it gets a lot tougher. And also the meat gets a lot larger. So you can imagine at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is keep it to a nice bite-sized piece of meat, because you're eating the whole animal similar to what you would with a mussel and a rock oyster. If you had to get to the point where you cut it up with a knife and fork, I don't think that we would lose a lot and it would be a lot tougher. So that's one of the big differences between, say, the rock oyster and mussels is rock oysters and mussels are traditionally in intertidal or in bayments along the coastline. So that makes them normally prone to, say, tidal influence. So both of them come in and out of the water with the tides. So they've got a natural mechanism in their shell that they can seal in and retain their water.
And you naturally flip them, don't you? Don't you naturally flip them?
No, not necessarily. No, they normally, because both mussels, especially mussels, run a bisel thread, so they decide which way they want to go up. So we definitely don't flip the Akoya. So in that sense, with the mussels and the rock oyster, they've got a natural sealing mechanism, so they can come out of water and they can live out of water for up to 2 weeks and then go back into water. Akoya oysters are similar to scallops in the fact that they never come out of the water. So they haven't got that sealing mechanism.
Yeah.
So they do live their whole life in the water and they don't come out. They don't come in and out with the tide like other bivalves.
So when you discovered the Akoya, or you looked at it and you thought there's an opportunity here, had you looked at other species and discarded them? What was it about the Akoya that took you on this journey?
The Akoya are unique in the fact that they run a bisal thread. So if anyone knows mussels, they call it the beard. It's a set of hairs, so they can actually put out. And most oyster species and scallop species can only put those hairs out in their juvenile stages. But the Akoya actually run them for the whole of their life. So anytime they can actually run a hair out and move themselves around and also attach to each other. They're very social animals, so they love being next to each other. So they end up, you find them in big clumps. They can move around. If you put them in a basket, they'll all go to one end of the basket and they'll move around. And they use their hairs to do that. So that's what makes it so farmable for us. So that's what we're looking for when we farm. If you look at a traditional, say, a scallop, and current scallops that actually swim around a bit, they're not attached to any object. They if you then put them in the basket, they'd end up sort of cutting themselves and interacting too much that they would sort of cut themselves up into pieces, and it's just not viable to farm. But an animal that runs a bisal thread like a mussel all of a sudden changes that game. So when we started to see the characteristics of the Akoya, and we'd been farming mussels for so long, all of a sudden, the light sort of came on and we're saying, well, it means we can grow this to the scale similar to mussels. And it's one of those species. There's other species out there and we are looking, but the Akoya really came to the top of the line early on.
Do you remember your first feeling when you actually tasted it?
Look, it's a unique one. Obviously, you start with it raw. And really, I was never, being a shellfish farmer and growing up with mussels, mussels are something you traditionally don't eat raw. They're normally always cooked. So I was sort of brought up mostly on the mussel side of it, and that's predominantly we were farming. So look, raw, I've acquired a taste for it now, but in the early days, I much preferred it cooked.
Right.
So, when the first taste, but look, the Akoya's, everyone asks us to describe how it, and where it fits into the shellfish world. I sort of believe it sort of stands on its own in a sense, because one of the unique things with Akoya when you look at it compared to a rock oyster is it's got a very large abductor muscle. And that gives it a lot more texture. So when you talk about an abductor muscle, we talk about the thing when you eat a scallop and the white circle of flesh, that's a scallop's abductor muscles. And that's when you talk about bivalves, the scallop has the largest.
Right.
So you see that big white thing. And then when you get down to a rock oyster, it's probably the size of the top of a pen. And then the Akoya sits somewhere in between. So it's sort of a blend of, between a scallop or a clam but the abductor muscle gives it a lot more texture.
So introducing a new species to the culinary world is what you're doing at the moment. And in those conversations with introducing it to people, what is the feedback that you're getting? You've obviously been on this journey for a little while now, playing around with it for 5 or 6 years, I think you said.
Yeah. Yes.
So how is that process of introducing a totally new product to the market?
Look, after 6 years, to believe that we've come this far in actually introducing a whole new species into the food world, it's just amazing how far we've got. I would have never said where we sort of accumulated last month in Melbourne, where we got to present to some of the best chefs in Melbourne, and for me that was just breathtaking in that we've come that far. And originally, in a sense, I was a good mussel farmer or bivalve farmer in the sense of that, and our marketing skills were probably the old we'd give out a stubby holder at Christmas. So the journey of actually seeing what we've done with the Leeuwin Coast and the team that we've got there is just amazing. And look, at the end of the day, I would have never believed it 6 years ago. And the fact that we're in a sense only in the domestication phases of 6 years. We've only had 5 or 6, probably less than that, probably about 4 full harvests. So we're learning as much on production side, and now we're getting it in front of the chefs who are, in a sense, making art of it, in a sense. So some of the stuff I've seen them do is just amazing.
In the cooking applications, which ones stand out to you?
Look, that's something that's, in a sense, when we look at the rock oyster, and if I went to probably 100 restaurants and I had rock oysters, I'd probably have the rock oysters 4 or 5 different ways. We're getting to the point now when every restaurateur does it a different way. So at the end of the day, my thought is in a couple of years, I'll go to 100 restaurants and we will have the Akoya 100 different ways. And look, at the end of the day, in presentation, taste, they're all good. I haven't had a bad one yet. They seem to blend well, and the chefs seem to be able to do things to them that I can't believe each time. I do like the things. I like them lightly steamed, and one of my favourites early on was just basically with a bit of mirin and ginger on them. That was mine. But look, at the end of the day, having said that, some of the stuff I've seen at Melbourne now sort of blows me away to some extent.
So the versatility is what I'm, hearing from what you just said. And I guess for the culinary world, it's really a first, isn't it, to have a product that doesn't have much of a culinary reference point or history. I mean, you referenced obviously that there was probably some byproduct eaten by the Japanese in the pearl production process, but this hasn't been used as a culinary product before. So that's really quite an amazing innovation for the world. And great for chefs to have something to play around with, like a blank canvas.
Yes, and to some extent from what we're hearing back from the chefs, because it's really a journey with them now. We've sort of got to this point, 6 years, we've got some production up and running, and now it's really we've got to put it in front of the chefs and say, okay, well, where's this Akoya going to fit in the food world? And that's going to be the interesting thing. We think it's got a lot of legs there. And it's really got to be that feedback from them. But at the end of the day, we're still on early days. It's sort of we're just starting, really, I believe.
And it's open to interpretation, isn't it? From a chefing perspective, like Lucy just said, it is very exciting to be able to cook with an ingredient and take it in many different ways. Yeah.
And look, we've put names in front of it before. We've sort of said it's jewelry on a plate to some extent, because if it's the mother of the pearl, the nacre inside is very presentable. We have sort of told the restaurant world or the chefs that they're really on their menu, they need to put a little warning on there that would say, may contain pearl.
Some lucky person.
And please return to staff when down. but yes.
So what about the shells, though? Are the shells still salvaged and used in other ways for the Akoya?
At this stage, that's really it's early days on that side of it. At the moment, we're not recollecting the shells, because when we send out to the restaurants, whether they reuse them as a presentation source, that's something, or whether we go down in the past, a lot of things such as rock oysters and whatever, they're recollecting a lot of the shells from the restaurants to use for artificial reef reef restoration, so they can put them back into the seabed, and that shell adds as a sort of a road base or a base for the reefs. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of sort of new science coming around, things like the fact that putting a calcium carbonate shell in there actually attracts the juvenile larvae of the other species.
So it's just rebuilding that ecosystem.
It's rebuilding the ecosystem, which is something we're fairly passionate about. We're involved in a lot of that as well.
So that's what I was going to ask, because the other side to all of this project is not just the innovation of what you're cultivating and creating, but if you look at the environment you're in, I mean, Albany is quite a unique place in its own right, but you're also very focused on the sustainability and the ecosystem of the waters, aren't you?
100%, in the sense that when you look at Albany and we look at the temperature zone that we talked about for Akoya before, and we sort of said that they range somewhere between, say, I think about, say, 13 and, say, 27 degrees. You look at Albany and think it'd be fairly cold when you look at it, the sense where it sits within the Australian mainland. But what happens in Western Australia, we have what they call a Leeuwin current. And that's a current that travels all the way down the coastline of Western Australia, bringing warm water from the north. And just at the end of that, it wraps around the bottom end and puts it into Albany. And so the areas where we've got the farms basically are at the bottom end of that Leeuwin Coast. And so that keeps the water temperature warm, which we think that adds a perfect spot for growing the Akoya. That's something we'll play around as time goes on, and if we may move it up the coastline and see how it goes in the warmer waters, it definitely will survive. It's going to be then, does it change its taste profile? They're all part of the journey to come, I think, but at the end of the day, we've started somewhere. But when you get to start talking about sustainability, look, that's one of the big factors in our company. There's no two ways about it. That's come from the top down. That we've got to do that. And so when we look at things, when you look at bivalves, they basically produce calcium carbonate in the shell. So in that sense, when we look at when the shell is disposed of, even if it's disposed in landfill, it will still bind that carbon up for thousands of years.
Right.
In the sense that it won't rot away. So let's say you put a timber back in landfill. It'll probably release its carbon as it rots away over the next 40 or 50 years. But if you look at shellfish, old reefs and whatever, there's I think the ones in Swan River dated back 4,000 years. The shells are still look as though the day they died.
Wow.
So it binds that up a lot. We farm using the technology of mussel farming traditionally now for Akoya. So that involves us doing this really small infering of an anchor around 600 mils in diameter that's screwed into the seabed and basically running long lines and ropes to the surface with floats. So if we had to abandon the site or we left the site, we can actually extract all our gear fairly quickly, and within, a couple of months you wouldn't even know we've been there. So that's our footprint's fairly small. When you look at the Akoya, because we grow it on mussel, we can use the whole of the water column. So we're actually three-dimensional. If you looked at, say, a traditional, say on land, you would look at only using, the plant would grow to whatever height, say a wheat crop would maybe grow 50 centimetres high. We can use the whole, if we're in 18 metres of water, we can use that whole 18 metres. We drape the ropes up and down. So our footprint compared to other species can be fairly small, but we can grow some very large volumes.
And presumably you're creating an ecosystem in the water that other species can thrive in as well, or live and thrive in?
Yeah. So Akoyas are what they call filter feeders. So they're feeding on microscopic plants or algae. And they also become habitat for lots of other marine species, mostly in the nursery stages. So you can imagine crabs, prawns, all of that need a stage when they move from their larvae forms into what we call into a crustacean form. So there's a huge amount of that within the system. So it is a functioning ecosystem. Some of the other things is we as farmers become custodians in a sense of that water, because we rely so heavily on that water being clean and pristine without any pollutants in it, so that it comes like a canary in the coal mine. Yeah. And the amount of testing that we do on the water, so it's probably the most tested water in the region.
So once you've harvested them, what's your next step then to get them to market?
Yeah, so that's always been a big question that the sort of food industry asks us, is that what we're doing now is we're harvesting them in volume and then snap freezing them using blast freezers. And we're doing that because, like we discussed before, the Akoya has no mechanism for a shelf life out of water. Mm. So as soon as we bring it out of water, it loses its fluid, unlike a mussel or a rock oyster would, and it starts the deterioration process there. So look, day one, it's 100%. But day 2, 3, it really quickly declines. So for that sense, we bring it in, snap freeze it straight away in the shell, and then basically and do it like that. So it'll never be a product that you can actually bring around live.
And have you experimented with that process a bit? Like, did you try other methods, and this has been the method that you believe preserves the optimum freshness of the Akoya?
Yes, look, we've tried various methods. At one stage, we're putting rubber bands trying to hold the fluid in, but It just hasn't got that sealing mechanism. Mm. In other places of the world, they've put little staples on or little clips to hold them shut, but even that they still haven't got a sealing mechanism or a membrane inside that seals it. So none of those things work. But look, on the flip side of that, environmentally, once we've frozen them, we're not using any plastic in the packaging. We're just using cartons. So we're putting them, say, 50 or, depending on the size range, 50 to 70 in a box. It fits very neatly into a freezer space, and we can ship them anywhere using, containers. So it's, compared to other products, we don't need to fly them around like you would with rock oysters or any other than bivalves or crayfish. So we think that, that we see that as an advantage, and it also ends up with no wastage at the other end. So when chefs will bring them out of there, or people want to use them, then the defrosting process is really quick. They normally bring them out within, half an hour, or sitting on the bench there defrosted, because they're not a large animal. So I think that, that outweighs some of the negativity.
And I suppose there's other products that happens to, and we don't really question that. So it's really just getting to grips with this as a new product, and then understanding that that's the process which holds it at its optimum freshness and, keeps that flavor there. So it makes a lot of sense. So what's next? Where does the Akoya go from here? We mentioned at the beginning this is quite a new journey, so it's still evolving.
Yes. Well, we've got it this far in regard to the production sense on the farm side of it. So it's really now the journeys with the chefs and the food industry to sort of say, okay, where does it fit in there? And at the moment, we started off obviously in Western Australia, and we've put it out there, and had traction. And then last month we did Melbourne. But I think in the coming plans we're flying, and each time we're doing it, we're learning just as much as in the past. So I think Sydney's next, and from my understanding, we're just going to keep going from there.
It is wonderful, though, from a culinary perspective, to be on this journey with you.
We're really excited to see where this product heads, because it's innovation like we haven't really seen in a very long time. And the taste of place is amazing as well. You know, the taste of that remote part of Australia and a very special place with a very particular climate and ecosystem. So that's exciting as well.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that I like about the whole journey is that the fact that, and especially when we're starting to get involved with the restaurants and whatever, is the fact that sustainability has sort of become one of the pillars in their decision-making processes.
Yeah.
So basically we have to sort of make an argument, and we have to say what, Akoya we believe should be on the menu for these reasons. So it sort of gives us we've really got to give all our environmental credentials just to get on the menu these days. And I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, it's an exciting conversation, because it is where we need to move our mindset. You know, it's about eating food that is native and has a small footprint on the world, or, no footprint on the world, as you were indicating, and thinking about all those points in the journey of getting to the plate of, like you said, packaging and no waste. So to have a product that is ticking all of those boxes is fantastic.
And look at I suppose we're just virtually in the protein business, in the sense that when we look at we want to produce proteins at the best equivalent to, food conversion ratios. And so when you look at the Akoya, they really stack up in all those areas, and no fresh water is used in the production. When you look at some of the, terrestrial stuff, a lot of fresh water is being used, and that's going to get harder and harder to get as time goes on.
Yeah.
And so that's a big part.
It's fascinating. And you must be, as you said at the beginning, you can't imagine that 6 years ago you would have been here. So it's going to be great to see where you and the Akoya and the company is in 5 or 6 years' time.
My vision would be that at the end of the day, we get the Akoya off the ground, and then I suppose we look back to the ocean, and we're constantly doing that and saying, well, look, the world, it's full of those food sources. It's just there's things there that we haven't touched, and I love that journey. We're sort of paving the way with this one. I think at the end of the day we can keep exploring. We've got to look at the different food sources in the world that are sustainable to face these coming years. And I think the Akoya, and it's even the fact that we're getting people to change their eating habits, then that's amazing.
Real quickly, we touched on different sizes, but are you going with small, medium, and large, or how are you identifying the sizes?
We think that it's more of an age between, say, 12 to 18 months, and really at that point we're waiting on the feedback now from the food industry to say, okay, what is it they want? What do they consider? A lot of and we're getting mixed reports.
Can I ask you a question real quick? Yep. Is there someone that you would like us to have on the Straight to the Source podcast that you would like to listen to or hear from?
That's a sort of question. Look, I think at the end of the day, talking to someone about the marketing or the food industry, have them and their perspective on the product. And I suppose at the end of the day, we have some great chefs involved, and maybe that would be a logical step, and sort of seeing where that fits in. And I'd love to hear their take on the environmental angles that the industry's moving on, and how between the two of us, we work together and say, at the end of the day, make the environment front and centre in this whole process.
Well, we can't wait for the rest of the world to discover it when it's ready to head offshore. And we're certainly looking forward to watching that journey and seeing the evolution of the product. Thank you for joining us today. It's been really fascinating to talk to you and hear all about it.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back on. We're on this journey with you, and we're every step of the way. And so let's see where it goes.
That's great. Thanks a lot for having us on. And I think I look forward to podcast number 2.
Yeah.
We do too. Thank you so much. It's nice to meet you. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Face to face in Sydney, hopefully soon.
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn.
Have
we
a great
really appreciate
weekend.
your time.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in with us today. We really hope you enjoyed listening as much as we've enjoyed the conversation. You'll find links to anything mentioned in today's chat in the show notes. We have some extraordinary guests lined up, and we'd love for you to join us again. Please make sure you're following us on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. We'd love feedback, good or bad, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from. Please just let us know. And the best way to stay up to date with what we're doing, who we're talking to, and where you'll find us around the country is to become part of our Straight to the Source community at straighttothesource.com.au/community. Until next time.